Okay, hello, and class today was very educational. It's been a long afternoon, but this is Chapter 20, Girding for War, the North and the South, 1861-1865. First of all, when Abraham Lincoln becomes president, the nation is literally divided. I can imagine that was a difficult situation to be in. Second of all, at the start of the war, the South actually had several advantages, which we will talk about in detail in a few here, but they were unable to secure foreign aid, and so they are not able to be victorious in the war itself. And finally, there is continued tension between the Union and Great Britain, and we'll cover that as well. Lincoln put the ball in the court of the South when he said that there really wouldn't be any conflict unless they provoked it. And he does this by discussing geographic features and says that really there is no geographic divide between the North and the South. The Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains run in the wrong direction, is what the pageant says. And so, maybe that's symbolic. Maybe it's also a nice reflection of the interconnectedness between the North and the South. And I guess it's a pretty good argument to make, too, as well. He also says that secession would create new controversies. What percent of the national debt would belong to the South? How much of the new territories in the West would the South control? How do we enforce the fugitive slave law? What happens if the Underground Railroad kicks up again? And then what will we do if Europeans begin to meddle and play the sections against one another? It'd be a divided America. It would be easier for Europe to conquer, I suppose. And it also raises the question of, I guess, mutual defense. And would the North and the South cooperate against any sort of imperial efforts of European nations? So when Lincoln takes off, there's only really two forts left in the South that are of significance that actually fly the Union flag. And the largest of the two is Fort Sumter. It's located in Charleston, South Carolina Harbor. It had about 100 men stationed there, and it needed supplies. Lincoln adopts a sort of middle-of-the-road solution and says that provisions, as opposed to reinforcements, will be sent to the fort. The South sees through this. They see this as an act of northern aggression. And by the way, some still do refer to the Civil War in its entirety as the War of Northern Aggression, so that sentiment still exists. South Carolinians, though, on April 12th, 1861, fired upon Fort Sumter, and after roughly 34 hours or so, the fort surrenders and the men flee. And that inspires several other states now, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, all to secede and join the Confederate States of America. The capital of the Confederate States, by the way, will be moved to Richmond, Virginia. And at that point, Lincoln calls upon Union states to supply militiamen. So many people signed up initially that some were actually turned away. And here is an image of the bombing of Fort Sumter that is found in our textbook. So there are 5 border states that are crucial to both the North and the South. Those are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. And they are slave states that had not seceded from the Union. They had large populations. They had manufacturing. They had horses. They also contained the Ohio River, which is a vital necessity for both the North and the South to transport crops and grains and so forth. Lincoln's very careful not to lose those states or push them away. And he says several times officially that the war is being fought to preserve the Union as opposed to ending or abolishing slavery. And that's obviously an appeal to them. Other groups are involved, including the 5 civilized tribes, which are located in Oklahoma, and they sided with the Confederates. In fact, they were able to send delegates to the Confederate Congress. Ironically, most Plains Indians sided with the Union. But as the section is titled, families were genuinely divided over this, and the book mentions sons of the same family fighting on opposing sides. And Abraham Lincoln's wife had brothers who fought for the Confederate cause, and in that regard, it truly was dividing. And here's a map so you can see the border states here. So at the start of the war, the South had several advantages. First of all, they were fighting a defensive war, which meant that not only did they not have to leave their home, but they only had to fight to a draw. The North, would have to conquer the South, whereas the South would just have to fight hard enough that the North might give up. They were led by quality military leaders such as Robert E. Lee, who was actually offered the command of the Union forces by Abraham Lincoln. He turned that down. When his native state of Virginia seceded, he left to fight for the Confederate cause. And the book also makes the case that Southern men, just based on the nature of how they grew up, were more suited for war. They were around horses more and firearms more, and therefore they transitioned to infantry and cavalry very easily. Now, the North obviously had this industrial power behind them, and they also had 75% of the nation's wealth and rail systems. So that is significant that they can produce goods and they can transport those goods in a very quick and efficient way. They also had a very large population, which of course was supplemented by immigrants. Many of those immigrants, I think 20% of the folks who fought for the Union were immigrants, so many of them did enlist for the Union cause as well. Okay, so you can see this table on page 425 in the American pageant, but if you just look down the right-hand side, you can see that the southern states were responsible for less than 10% of all manufacturing in 1860. And this table also appears on page 425. A couple things you can observe from this. First of all, at least from 1861 to 1866, immigration is increasing steadily. Also, as said before, a lot of the Irish immigrants will move to cities and enter into the industrial field, and therefore helping that northern war machine. So, as I said before, the South certainly needed foreign aid, and the British would have been a wonderful ally for them, as you can imagine. It seems as though the British ruling elite did favor the Southern way of life. They liked the semi-feudal system. They did not like this experiment in democracy. But the commoners of Britain and France started to support the North more. They, as wage slaves, you might say, really wanted to see the end of slavery. Now, there was a British dependence on Southern cotton, and we talked about that already. I think they imported 75% of their cotton from the American South. But in the years leading up to the Civil War, there was a surplus of cotton which made its way to England. And so that delayed the shortage of cotton that would have been created by this Union blockade. In addition to that, there was a drought in England which created a real desire for grain from the United States, or anywhere for that matter. And fortunately for the United States, King Wheat and King Corn could fill that role. All right, so let's look at the beginning of the conflict between the United States and Great Britain. First of all, there's the Trent Affair that you should know about in late 1861. There were two Confederate diplomats aboard this British mail steamer called the Trent, and they were heading for Europe. They were captured by a Union vessel, and obviously the English are outraged by this, and they actually began to send troops to Canada in retaliation. President Lincoln did reduce this conflict, though, by freeing the Confederate prisoners. I think he said one war at a time. Also, British shipyards are producing Confederate commerce raiders, and these are, for a lack of a better term, pirate ships. A notable example of this would be the Alabama. It, in its own right, captured over 60 vessels, and the British did attempt to end this practice and announce some sort of policy of neutrality in 1863, but the commerce raiders, destroyers themselves, captured over 250 Yankee ships. And so this section is about conflict between the United States and Great Britain and later with France. And first in 1863, the Laird rams were being built near completion in a British shipyard. They were larger than the Alabama, which we previously discussed. And they actually had this iron ram on the front that could be used to destroy the Union blockade of the South. Now, Charles Francis Adams, the ambassador to England and the son of John Quincy, said to Great Britain that if those ships were delivered, it would mean war. And so, to avoid that, the London government bought the ships for the Royal Navy instead. A few years later, in 1867, the Dominion of Canada was established, partly as a way to protect Canada against the possible vengeance of the U.S. I think that is directly in response to the Irish militia that was running, makeshift militia that was running raids across the border. Now, with France in 1863, the Emperor Napoleon III established a puppet government in Mexico City with the Archduke of Austria Maximilian as the French emperor. And of course, this is a direct violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but the United States is occupied with the Civil War. After the Civil War, Secretary of State Seward does march south and force Napoleon to abandon Maximilian in Mexico City. And I believe Maximilian is executed by the firing squad. Here's an example of those Laird rams. You can see the iron front. And here is Charles Francis Adams, slightly happier than his father. The comparison in this section is less about the men themselves and more about the situation they were faced with. And first of all, you should understand that the North had this long-established government. We can call it that by now. It was financially stable, as we said already, and it was recognized both at home and abroad. The South had a bit more of a complicated situation. First of all, they were founded upon this whole principle of secession. And so they include this idea of secession within their constitution, and it really puts a lot of emphasis on states' rights, which becomes somewhat crippling to the South. President Jefferson Davis himself was actually often at odds with his own Congress, and his task of being president of this collection of states in rebellion proved to be beyond his powers. And here is Lincoln on the left and Jefferson Davis on the right. So, because Congress was not in session when the war started, President Lincoln took several actions that normally would have to be approved by Congress. First of all, he initiated a blockade. Secondly, he increased the size of the federal army. He also directed the Secretary of the Treasury to advance $2 million without appropriation or security to three private citizens for military purposes. And he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which means that a person being detained could not challenge the lawfulness of that detainment. And so initially the Union Army was all volunteer, but by 1863 there was need to increase the number of soldiers in the Army, and so a draft was used. Unfortunately for some, and fortunately for others, one could pay $300 to buy a replacement. And so there's this ongoing concern about the privileged class that can avoid the war, or perhaps even that rich men start wars and poor men fight them. And as a result of that, there were draft riots in New York City, largely run by Irish immigrants. The Confederacy also passed a draft law. Now, in this table, you can see a sort of comparison of how many men were in uniform at any given time. And if you look through this, you can see that the Union always had more men in uniform. So the North, being better off financially speaking, makes it through the economic stresses of war a bit easier. They increased tariffs and excise taxes to financially support the war, and they created the first income tax. In early 1861, after enough anti-tariff Southern members had seceded, Congress passed the Morrill Tariff Act. It's a high protected tariff that increased duties 5 to 10%, and it's designed to raise additional revenue and provide more protection for the Northern manufacturers. A protected tariff, by the way, came to be identified with the Republican Party. The Washington Treasury also issued paper money, and they're called greenbacks. The greenback currency was not backed by gold, it was backed by the Union's perceived credit, and so because of this, the value of the greenback was constantly changing. In 1863, Congress authorized the national banking system, and it was designed to stimulate the sale of government bonds and establish a standard currency. Banks that joined the national banking system could buy government bonds and issue paper money that was backed by those bonds. The Confederate Army also issued bonds and raised taxes, and they printed their blue-backed paper currency, which was subject to runaway inflation. So, as is often the case, Northern industry did benefit from war, and newly invented labor-saving machinery, such as mechanical reapers, allowed that to happen. Petroleum was also discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. There's a real rush of the 59ers to enter into that industry. The Homestead Act of 1862 also provided free land to many people in the West. And the Civil War opened up many jobs for women that were originally occupied by men. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, for example, was organized by women to provide medical support to the Union armies in the field. So at the end of the day, the Northern blockade severely restricted the South's economy. Transportation in the South, what little transportation there was, collapsed during the Civil War, and cotton capitalism had been defeated by industrial capitalism. Okay, that's it for tonight. It's been a long day. I'll see you tomorrow in class. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or just ask me then. Have a good night.